Number 15. The Psychic. Flight attendants have some of the best scary airplane stories. Redditor Mystic Curse shares hers from her stint at Northwest Airlines in the late 2000s. In fact, this scary event occurred on her last flight from Minneapolis to Detroit. The flight was doomed from the get-go. Mystic Curse writes, "For starters, we had a self-proclaimed psychic on board who informed everyone that this plane is going down by screaming it at the top of her lungs as soon as we reached cruising altitude. And then it seemed the psychic's vision was coming true. The plane hit some major turbulence, drinks flying, overhead bins opening, passengers terrified and screaming. Even some of the flight attendants were crying, basically all due to the psychic. But once they reached their approach to Detroit, it wasn't over. As the plane touched down on the icy runway, it slid sideways, and Mystic says she's surprised it didn't flip over. The Redditor quit the minute they unloaded the aircraft, and the flight's passengers received $350 vouchers, which is almost unheard of in the airline industry. Now that's when you know you were on a really bad flight." Number 14. Turbulence. There's nothing more frightening than when your plane gets shaky. Is it just normal turbulence, or is it signaling something more dire? Redditor TransATL Antique posted her experience as a flight attendant for a regional airline whose fleet included Embraer 145s, which are very small and cramped airplanes. One night on a flight from Denver to Durango, there was some turbulence over the mountains. Mountain turbulence was normal, and they'd been pre-warned about the forthcoming bumpy ride, but this time was different. She'd been told to strap into her jump seat and not to get up for the duration. In her words, 15 minutes into the flight, it's pitch black because I have the lights off. It's so turbulent, I'm convinced we are going to bounce into a mountain, and I start hearing alerts from the flight deck. According to the attendant, a series of rare warning dings and a sudden sideways 1,000-foot drop made her think this was her last flight and her last moments on Earth. In her words, people were screaming and crying, and honestly, that is the only moment of my career where I thought this is how I pass away. Of course, she didn't pass away. What had happened was that the turbulence had been so bad, it had kicked off the autopilot and they couldn't get it to re-engage. Although turbulence is a normal flying, this sounds like everyone's worst fear. Number 13. In the leg. Imagine a time where a passenger could take a piece on the plane. You're imagining an era when the grandpa of a Redditor named Trust Me I Jewish was charged with the responsibility of piloting. Back in the 70s, this grandpa was a pilot for Eastern, an airline that no longer exists. During that time, it was not uncommon for flights to get taken over when traveling to Florida. The planes were often then taken to Cuba. One flight to Florida, a flight attendant burst into the cockpit, asking for scissors. Thinking it's a joke, his grandpa and his co-pilot said, "Of course, pilots always carry scissors at all times." Annoyed, the flight attendant slammed the door. As it turns out, a local sheriff was so worried about the plane being taken over that he'd somehow managed to smuggle a piece on the plane, which was legal at the time but certainly frowned upon. While in the plane's bathroom checking his piece, he accidentally fired upon himself in the leg. The flight attendant was looking for scissors to cut some makeshift bandaging. It's unclear how this story ended, but we're guessing it was with more than the sheriff's fair share of hurt pride. Number 12. 2 minutes of oxygen left. What would you do if you knew you only had 2 minutes left to live? Redditor Ray-Ban Pat experienced the sudden experience but lived to tell the tale. When traveling for work, the Redditor had a few drinks after his luggage was lost, so when he boarded the plane, he wasn't in the soundest of minds. And he compounded that by having a few more drinks. He turned on the sci-fi thriller Prometheus. With his earbuds plugged in, he started dozing, falling in and out of sleep. All of a sudden, he heard an announcement in his earbuds in a British accent, declaring that there were only 2 minutes of oxygen left. He wrote, "I look up and see on the map we're over an area that is known for conflict in the region." And I freak out thinking it was the British flight attendants that announced it. I throw my headphones off, start asking loudly why the oxygen masks aren't coming down, as he came to and realized the announcement was made not in real life but on the movie, and that his fellow passengers were staring at him in wonder. He sat quietly back down. A flight attendant approached to make sure he was alright, and when he explained what happened, she was cool about the whole thing. In fact, she gave him another drink. I imagine he needed it after such embarrassment and needless fear. Number 11. Overloaded. Some flights are so heavy that scary things follow suit. Redditor Really Rabid Billy was flying from O'Hare to MIA in a full airplane, and we're talking completely full. As they were taxiing out, someone from the crew announced, "Folks, this plane is overloaded. We are taxiing out to a landing runway so that it will take off." As the plane started to take off, the Redditor counted until liftoff. It took 56 seconds instead of 25, which was the average. Having flown this route for a while, the Redditor knew what looked normal, and this wasn't it. The flight route seemed a lot more elevated than usual. According to Really Rabid Billy, it definitely looked like we were much higher than usual to be landing in the short distance that remained. Instead of revving the engines for landing, the plane got quiet and felt like it was dropping. Suddenly, the engine seemed to come to life, and the plane started climbing. While outside, the blue lights from the airfield were apparent. Just as Really Rabid Billy started to think this is wrong, the plane hit the ground, and every door from the overhead compartments burst open, with 3 doors coming clean off their hinges, bags flying out and all. The oxygen masks dropped as passengers clasped onto their seat armrests like there was no tomorrow. Everyone was screaming, thinking the plane was falling apart. The plane had bounced, but the crew regained control, and everyone survived another day to tell of this scary airplane incident. Number 10. Being inside thunder. Have you ever flown through a storm? Then this one's for you. Redditor Speed Peeler wrote of his private flight to Nice, France in June of 2015. He was heading to the airport when a call informed him that flights were cancelled due to storms over France and the UK. Being that his flight was not a commercial flight, his private flight wasn't cancelled, though obviously the advice was to avoid flying. However, because the captains couldn't get a consensus on the safety of the flight, whoever paid for it decided to push their luck. In normal conditions, the flight is usually an hour and a half, but about an hour into the flight, the co-pilot came on over the intercom to inform passengers that turbulence was about to pick up. As Speed Peeler describes it, what happened next was a 10-seater plane being caught in a lightning storm rolling in from every angle. After dropping 5,000 feet, the plane rolled to its side and also delved into a nosedive. Speed Peeler wrote, "The lights went out, rain hitting us, and we could see nothing but rain and pitch black with occasional lightning out the front window." The video stating the time to the destination had gone out, and upon return it seemed they weren't moving forward at the speed they should be. The wind was knocking them back to the point that they were traveling around a train speed. The bumpy travel had everyone in tears, while the co-pilot closed his eyes as the plane's side dove down another 40 seconds. Instead of climbing again to altitude, the pilot began dodging the storm, with lightning flashing repeatedly. Speed Peeler wrote, "I held my ears from the sound of being inside thunder. This nightmare took more than an hour, but the plane did land, and the pilot said flight conditions had been the worst he had ever flown, and communications had disappeared halfway through the flight. In fact, those waiting to greet their loved ones had been informed that their plane was missing, since they'd vanished from the ground control's radar." Well, nothing so frightening has happened on board a flight to Speed Peeler since. He is scared for life by this incident. Even typing this haunts me, he writes. Who can blame him? Number 9. Help me. Most of us can relate to scary passenger experiences, but how many of us can relate to the fear of pilot experiences when things go wrong? Redditor TG McGonagall shares his story as a co-pilot of a DC-9 heading to LaGuardia. As a newbie to the industry, the day was perfect for flying. No reason to anticipate something might go haywire, at least until the Redditor looked over to find the captain was turning right, only for the aircraft to not follow suit and roll left instead. As the plane banked 60 degrees, the nose started taking a nosedive, and the pilot spoke 2 words that no newbie co-pilot wants to hear: help me. The Redditor did what he needed to do, applied the right rudder, which snapped the airplane to the right, where it needed to be. Although the aircraft seemed to suspend in the air for a moment, after it snapped into place, they resumed arrival, wondering what went down. Their questions were answered by the tower control, who said, "Use caution for wake turbulence." We had been caught in the wingtip vortex of a much heavier aircraft, which had attempted to roll us inverted. Although the Redditor notes that the warning should have been given 10 minutes earlier, at least it wasn't offered too little too late. Number 8. Midnight evacuation. Redditor Sarah Zilla shared this crazy personal tale that will blow yours right out of the water. It was the 90s when this Redditor was living in the Middle East with her parents and siblings. Quite rightly, it was the nicest airport Sarah Zilla had ever been in. Parents and friends from school were waiting in the terminal when Sarah and her family arrived. This is when the reality of the matter finally struck a chord. They parted with their father and boarded the airplane. In Sarah Zilla's own words, the entire experience was very surreal. Essentially, I was being evacuated from the Middle East on a CIA flight, escorted by F-16 fighter planes. While Sarah Zilla notes that this is one of the coolest experiences of her life, she also says it was one of the scariest in hindsight. What do you think? I'd have to go with terrifying considering the circumstances around the plane ride. Number 7. Creeper. March of this year saw a scary airplane encounter that went viral. A journalist was traveling on a late night flight when she heard an unseemly interaction happening in the row behind her. Joanna Chu had noted that the passengers behind her were a teenage girl and a man she believed to be in his late 30s. The teenager had been separated from the rest of her family on the flight, so the man started chatting with the young woman. Innocent enough at first, but soon it became creepy. Joanna tweeted about the event, describing what went down under the title "Thread About Airplane Creeps." She described the conversation between the two. The man asked the girl about her career plans, and when she told him she wanted to be a CEO, he laughed in her face and proceeded to give her what Joanna describes as ridiculous advice. According to a tweet from Joanna, as soon as he asked for a dirty photo while leaning close to her, I turned around and rage whispered exactly what I thought of that, and he didn't say anything back and went off to use the washroom. Moreover, Joanna went to inform a flight attendant of what was unfolding. When he escalated the situation and began cursing at Joanna, demanding to speak to the boss, the female head flight attendant responded, "I'm the boss, this is really serious and we could land the plane." Finally, he moved, the young woman was checked in with, and a report was written. The man was nabbed by security after the flight. The key takeaway from this viral story is that when we see such creepy behavior, each and every one of us can step in to do something. If these women had ignored the situation, this creep could have gotten even creepier. Number 6. Emergency exit. An anonymous Redditor writes that he was on a flight from Florida when a flight attendant tapped him on the shoulder and asked him to move to the emergency exit. After changing seats, the attendant gave Anonymous the rundown of how to open the door and whatnot. As they started taxiing, the flight attendant was in the jump seat opposite the Redditor. They exchanged small talk as the flight took off. When they hit about 5,000 feet, A loud bang was heard, and the emergency door seemed to move. Then again at 10,000 feet. The Redditor described the flight attendant as looking visibly upset. She even asked her passenger what the noise was. He replied that he didn't know, but he wasn't going to remove his seatbelt, which he didn't the full flight. In the Redditor's words, "I think I was more unnerved by her reaction than the noise. She looked on the verge of tears." Flight attendants are supposed to be stalwart figures, so when they become anything but, a million red flags fly. Luckily, the red flags didn't lead any further than a loud bang in this case. Number 5. The silent treatment. What happens when a pilot and co-pilot get into an argument? The silent treatment, of course. Redditor Steppity Step knows firsthand. Well, secondhand anyway. His stepfather was a commercial pilot, and during one such tiff, he wasn't talking to his co-pilot at the time. Once they were about to land, they almost collided with the ground because they were still not talking to each other, the Redditor wrote. I guess this is why arguments between pilots are never a good idea, since they could have such large consequences. Number 4. Going Nordo. Redditor Anime Brogelo shares his story. As an air traffic controller, when a pilot went Nordo, which means the pilot is no longer on the same frequency. Although going Nordo happens quite often according to the Redditor, the controllers have protocols to get pilots back into place. However, this particular pilot happened to go Nordo at exactly the wrong moment. As he was heading east, he was on an odd altitude when he lost frequency. His flight plan had him heading southbound soon to an even altitude, but since he went Nordo, that didn't happen. In the Redditor's own words, there were about a dozen different planes going northbound that were at his altitude, so he ended up running one heck of a gauntlet through all of these people as I was descending and climbing them to get out of his way. So as the flight traffic controller was attempting to move planes out of his path, he placed himself right back in theirs. With closure rates of more than 1,000 knots, reaction time is brief, so of course this was worrisome. Another one that could have ended pretty horribly. Sheer luck was on the pilot's side that day. Number 3. Look out. You might think other aircraft and birds are the only obstacles to look out for in the sky, but you'd be wrong. Redditor Boston Guy 245 shares his tale of piloting a private plane while flying his mother to breakfast. He was approaching an uncontrolled airport and making self-announcements on approach. The airport shared frequencies with a few other airports in the area, so noting the specific airport in question was important. Boston Guy did all of this and entered the landing pattern, announcing his approach on the radio. Just after he did so, someone yelled into the radio, "Look out." Boston Guy assumed impact was about to run its course, but that was not entirely the case. In his words, turns out they were skydivers being released at one of the other airports on the frequency, although the pilot and his mom had a laugh about it later. During the flight, needless to say, it was terrifying. Number 2. Turn back. It's never a good sign when your pilot has to turn back. Redditor Tango Foxtrot Sierra was that pilot. After taking off one night, the right alternator light lit up and the instrument lights began flickering. The Redditor's first officer was flying, so Tango directed him to keep going until they reached a safe altitude, so they could then go through the checklist. The right engine started sparking as they were climbing, leading to passenger panic. The first officer froze as Tango told him to turn back, and instead of going the direction specified for just such an emergency situation, he turned the opposite way. Tango took over the controls and told his first officer to contact air traffic control for an immediate return. Although the sparks were still coming off after the alternator was shut off, the engine was running. In Tango's words, "We were only in the air for a couple minutes, but the adrenaline was high for sure. Not an adrenaline rush I'd ever want to have. I'm just glad they managed to land safely." Before we get to number 1, my name is Chills and I hope you're enjoying my narration. If you're curious about what I look like in real life, then go to my Instagram at DylanIsChillinYT and tap that follow button to find out. It's a proven fact that generosity makes you a happier person, so if you're generous enough to hit that subscribe button and the bell beside it, then thank you. This way you'll be notified of the new video we upload every Tuesday. Number 1. Captain Overboard. This entry is one of the most surprising. In 1990, a British Airways flight from England to Spain experienced massive decompression shortly after takeoff. Due to a widespread panel that was installed wrong, the panel broke away, forcing the captain headfirst outside the aircraft. While the captain was pinned against the window frame in extreme cold conditions, the first officer took control. Flight attendants alerted passengers to get into the brace position for a possible emergency landing. As he held the captain's belt, the first officer attempted to send a distress call to air traffic control, but due to the noise from the wind, he couldn't hear their response, leading to a delay in initiating landing. While attempting to engage air traffic control and holding on to the captain, the first officer started developing frostbite. They assumed the captain passed away as his head collided repeatedly against the fuselage, but they held on to him anyhow. Finally, after getting clearance for an emergency landing, the plane touched ground after 20 minutes, surprisingly saving the captain's life. But of course, he did not walk away unscathed. He left the incident with frostbite and fractures. Incredibly, after a short 5-month stint of recovery, Captain Lancaster returned to work and continued piloting for nearly 2 more decades. Now that's some dedication. Thanks for checking out this video. Be sure to subscribe because we upload new countdowns every Tuesday and Saturday. Or if you're still not convinced, here are some of our other videos that I think you'd like. Enjoy!